It has been 1 week since the combat update has come to the live servers, and over the past week I have been figuring out DPS rotations, boss rotations, all of these good things with the combat triangle, just to see how strong it really is. And today I am doing a full DPS guide for melee and my findings so far. We'll be covering everything from the gear used to different ability type, to rotations with and without using Meteor Strike, whether certain special attacks are worthwhile or not. The list can go on forever, so let's just go ahead and get right into this guide. Quick disclaimer on this guide, there will be time codes in the description below, as this is going to be a relatively long video with a lot of information for you to process at once. You may have to watch a couple sections more than one time to understand what is being said, although I will be explaining things as clear and as simply as I can. And I also want to make things clear that I do not claim these to be the best rotations ever for melee or anything like that. I never have nor will claim to be the best meleeer on this game or try and speak from a position of authority in order to have people use my methods. I have simply made these few different melee rotations over the past week through testing and just my own findings, and pulling some information from friends that I have or other services such as Discord servers and other things of the sort. And I'm putting these out here for y'all to pull what information you need for you to improve your own PVM ability by simply providing my point of view from what I have learned so far. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get into this video. So starting off with the gear in my inventory and my worn equipment here, I have pretty much everything I think you could potentially use in regards to melee. There are some missing dragon weapons here that might potentially get some use, but I think this is a good start to go over. Now, yes, this looks like an absolute cluster of just random assortments of stuff, but we'll go ahead and break it down into small components. So the armor I am using is still Vestments of Havoc. It is still best in slot armor in 2024. However, the one change with it is in the perks that I am using. So I have Impatient 4 Mobile on the top as well as C4R5. C4R5 is not changed at all, but adding mobile to melee gear is a change that I have made here. And that is because with mobile on your gear, you still get adrenaline from using Barge, and I believe you still get it from Bladed Dive as well. And that has been a very nice update. So now we can Barge every 10 seconds should we want to. And it makes it to where we can save an inventory spot and not have some type of offhand or main hand mobile swap in our inventory somewhere. As far as gloves are concerned, it is enhanced gloves of passage with the enchantment effect. They are very strong, and these are the only real melee specific gloves we have right now that are worth anything. Most of the time you're probably going to be using Cinderbanes anyway, but I did want to include these for places if you want to start meleeing at like Raksha per se, or any other boss that does not allow weapon poison. These are absolutely going to be best in slot. A lot of discussion has come up over the pocket slot and what is actually best in slot for melee there, and from my findings so far, I'm still going to say that Grim is best in slot just due to the fact that it's 12% crit chance. And for some of the Zerk rotations that we'll take a look at later, this is almost impossible to ignore as that crit chance is massive. Now, if you're not doing crit builds, that's where a little bit of debate can come into play. I've seen some people experiment with full scripture. If you want more AoE damage, say on a Slayer task or something like that, you could do the Wen scripture. I haven't tested Jazz scripture at all. However, I imagine it would be pretty decent with all of the high hit spam. And I'll bring this up later when I'm talking about rotations that don't involve Meteor Strike or any type of crit buff. Lang swords have been reworked pretty heavily. Right now they do this thing where they add primordial ice strikes to the target. Well, technically they go on the player, so you can use the special attack on different targets, build it up on one thing, use it on another. But basically how it works is you have a 10% chance on each hit in order to generate a primordial ice strike. This will stack up to 10, and that is the cap. And these stacks do have some passive effects. Every time you apply a primordial ice strike to something, your melee damage goes up a little bit under the frost blades effect. It's a nice little bit of bonus damage when it procs, so it just kind of adds into it, and it's a passive, so it's not anything you have to worry about. And the weapon spec for Lang swords is the really nice change, because obviously they increased hit cap before, but now that doesn't doesn't really matter because hit cap is 30k. And basically think of the Lang spec as a form of Touch of Death and Finger of Death from Necromancy, where you're building up stacks, and Finger of Death will use less adrenaline based on how many stacks you have. But the more stacks you have with these Primordial Ice Strikes and the Lang weapon spec, the more damage you do. And I have seen this cap out at around 22 to 23k per hit, and it hits twice, and it's also an AoE hit. Basically a hurricane in its function, where it hits the main target twice, and then it hits every subsequent target or secondary target once. So for AoE clearing, it can be very strong, and overall I'm very happy with the Lang changes. I think they are pretty strong now as far as weapons are concerned. I have Reaver's Ring here just for the crit chance. I think Reaver's Ring is better. Getting Champion's Ring to work with this type of setup is kind of annoying. We used to have rotations that would force easy K inside of Zerk to get a few bleeds, and since Bleed Assault does count for this effect, you can get a decent amount of crit chance from this and critical strike damage as well. However, maintaining bleeds while in a Zerk rotation, this was mostly strong because the whip would almost always do some type of bleed to the target, thus always having the Champion's Ring activated, and then when you used Blood Assault, your crit chance would go higher than the Reaver's Ring. However, from my testing, not many people are using the Scourge anymore, and I haven't found it to be particularly useful so far. I've pretty much been with Lang Swords, although I am kind of biased. I've always hated the Scourge. I hated the idea of the Scourge existing. I really dislike the fact that a T92 is stronger than a T95, but I digress. I'm sure some spreadsheet wizards will come up with a rotation in Zerk in order to come up with Champion's Ring being on top. However, for now, I am keeping it simple with Reaver's Ring, just getting the guaranteed 5% crit chance. Zuck Cape is still best in slot in 2024. It boosts overpower to make the adrenaline cost a lot less, and it gives overpower an additional hit. And as far as worn equipment is concerned, that's pretty much it. By the way, the quiver is here just to hold Hydrix Bolt for crit rotations that require Grico, but I'll get into that later. If you're not going to bother with Grico on any of your rotations, you can go ahead and just wear Zamorgiel's Nexus, or you can also equip some armor spikes in the slot, whatever floats your boat. Now, on the topic of gear and equipment, I'll go ahead and go over everything that is in this worn equipment section. Starting off with the weapons, I have a physical easy K here. This is nice for a T95 cleave swap, and it is where you're only going to get Hurricane from now on. You still can get 2 Hurricanes per Zerk rotation, however, you're not going to get a Blood Destroy anymore. However, that's not too much of an issue at this point. Now, as far as perks on all of my gear, I did go a little bit over about the change for perks as far as like my armor is concerned, but I'm going to do a dedicated section in the time codes here on perks and everything that I have found so far. So I'll talk about perks later, but anyways, back to the weapons. And so having a physical easy K is going to be a little bit more advantageous now, again, because you can Hurricane, it's useful for Meteor, and having a tier 95 for those is going to be slightly better than using a Spear or a ZGS of some kind, just because the extra 3 tiers of damage is nice. Masterwork Spear of Annihilation is a strong weapon still. It is very useful in easy K rotations, as it extends all of the bleed durations by 50%. Scythe is still the best AoE machine that we have. Nothing else has halberd range right now that is above it, so maybe sometime in the future we'll see a improvement, like some type of T95 halberd or a different scythe, or maybe an upgrade for scythe or something. Who knows what we'll see. But for now, the Nox Scythe is the best AoE machine that we have. Pterosaur Maul is here because it is very strong where it works, but it mostly works in elite dungeons. There are a couple other bosses outside of elite dungeons where it works, but suffice to say, it is kind of limited. However, it is important to note because when the enchantment is active and you are using a T-Maul, it is a tier 105 weapon. I mean, technically it's like tier 104.8 by the damage numbers, but it round up to T105. And if you want a full list of what this weapon works on, you can go ahead and click this search wiki button here, and then just go ahead and type in Pterosaur Maul, and go ahead and press enter, and on your default browser and Windows, it will open up the Pterosaur Maul wiki page, and you can scroll down and see all the different bosses and other things that it works on, as well as different Slayer mobs and whatnot. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. As I alluded to earlier, the Scourge isn't really used so far. I haven't really seen too many many melee camps using it in too many places because the Lang spec is pretty powerful. Now, they have not added a charging effect to the Scourge like they wanted to. Again, I don't think charging effects are a good method for quote-unquote nerfing things in this game. I think it's pretty lazy overall, but that's another topic for another time. It seems to be a good mid-tier weapon to use with some type of offhand while you're saving up for your Langs. Now, the tier 85 Langs do get the special attack, but I'm not sure how that factors in as far as its damage is concerned compared to using Drygors or Khopesh. And I have not really done any budget testing. Everything I have been doing so far is for best in slot, but suffice to say I probably won't be using Scourge anytime soon. The Drygor here is just a flanking swap. It boosts the backhand and forceful backhand abilities. It's useful in a couple places, mostly in group encounters is where it's going to be used. There are a few spots in elite dungeons where you can get flanking, or other bosses where you can do what's known as walk under flanking. It is strong where it works, but again, its use case is limited. Now we get to one of a couple elephants in the room, and that is all of these EoFs here. Now, like I said in the beginning of the video, these are potentially useful EoFs. You're not going to be bringing all of these everywhere you go. You will pick and choose these depending on the boss, and you'll most likely only be bringing 2 or 3, maybe 4 EoFs if you're doing some type of like full-on damage setup plus AoE damage or something like that. But we will just go down the rows. So first off, I have a Dragon 2-hand here. It's a 50% adren cost base, and it does 1 hit to a bunch of targets. That's pretty powerful. This used to just cap at 10Ks normally. However, with the hit cap removed, this is actually a pretty nice upgrade for the D2H because it can actually do the damage that it's supposed to. And when used in combo with a scythe, you have a 7x7 area around you that gets hit by Dragon 2-hander. So for large AoE on multiple targets, or for certain mobs that spawn in weird patterns, this is a very useful tool, and you can use this in combination with Meteor Strike to get extra adren back to make the adren cost a lot less painful. Easy K is a bread and butter item in terms of in-between Zerk damage for longer melee rotations. Now, Easy K, I believe, hasn't had too much of a change. However, in this version of combat, it feels pretty weak, but it is still stronger than the alternatives, so you'll most likely be using this over anything else. And if you're doing long form melee damage, you're most likely going to be using Chaos Roar with the Easy K to double its damage, so it actually does a decent amount. I would like to see Easy K just get fully reworked at some point to be focused on something else that isn't just bleed spam. I have a couple of ideas, but I believe that is a topic for another video. Now, the reason you put an Easy K in an EoF is so you can equip it and then equip your Masterwork Spear, and this combination here will use the 50% bleed duration increase on the Easy K spec itself, and then that allows the other bleeds to do a lot more damage by being extended themselves. So yes, it is ideal to have an Easy K inside of an EoF and a physical one. However, they're not hyper expensive like they used to be. I believe these 2 Easy Ks I paid almost 3.5 bill each for, whereas I believe their recent prices are around 1.1 to 1.2, so not too terrible in price indeed, and you really don't need the physical one. Hurricane will be just fine when using a T90 or T92 weapon. It is a little bit overkill to have a cleave swap. However, most of my presets and most of the things I do in this game are definitely over the top and pedantic in nature, at least as far as chasing best in slot damage is concerned. So if you want to go all the way to the top, I definitely would get a physical Easy K on top of the EoF, but that's just me. Next up, we have Dragon Claws. These weapons are absolutely insane right now. They hit 4 times, and in Berserk they can hit upwards of 20,000 damage on the first 2 hits. Hit 3 and 4 from Dragon Claws is still, I believe, anywhere from 5 to 9,000 damage, at least from what I've seen, depending on what buffs you may or may not have stacked up. But it does 4 hits in 1 global cooldown, and all of those do have potential to crit, which can be quite a nice adrenaline refund. In combination with something like Incendiary Shot active, say on a dummy before the start of a kill, or if you have Meteor Strike going from building up through EZK. D-Claw spam seems to be here to stay, so we shall see how that goes. And it's still useful even if you're not doing crit builds. You can usually get 1 or maybe 2 off inside of a Berserk rotation. Overall, it is very worthwhile, and this is probably the first EOF I would go for when using melee, unless you're doing something like AFK Slayer where you would want D2H, or maybe something like Hallie. Speaking of which, Dragon Halberd is another AoE, and on the main target it'll hit it twice, and I believe on all the secondary targets it'll hit twice as well. In fact, I can just test it here, so I'll go ahead and hit the Hallie spec. And as you can see, it hits both targets twice, so any target that it hits, it will hit twice, which can be nice. However, the one drawback is that it only hits in cleave range, which is a cone in front of you. So it can be slightly obnoxious lining up targets in order to get them all in halberd range. However, most targets do end up working out. Like if you notice here, I'm standing here and you would think all of these targets would be in cleave range with a scythe. However, if I hit it, it only hits the middle one because these other ones aren't in the arc. However, if I pull out something like Dragon Two-Hander, it will hit all 3 of them. So that's just something to keep in mind when using Dragon Halberd. However, it is also less adrenaline cost and can be much more beneficial depending on setups on adrenaline refund. So it is definitely a worthwhile EOF to have. Now, you don't need a separate EOF to house it. You could just have a stack of Dragon Halberds, which I believe you can purchase from a store in Xanaris, and you can just buy D-Claws off the GE for relatively cheap. And depending on what you're using, you can switch back and forth between the two if you want to keep costs down. However, I went ahead and purchased every EOF possible, so I have just a bunch of them sitting with dragon weapons as fillers until new specs come out. But anyways, again, I digress. Stat Warhammer is considered a melee EOF. However, it gets used on all combat styles with Ingenuity of the Humans, at least for its damage. However, with the update, we pretty much have 100% accuracy on anything, so long as you're wearing melee equipment, and even then you will still get the hit for it. It might only hit like 5 damage, but you can still get the effect out regardless and save the Ingenuity of the Humans for something else. I believe this is still used at Rago and AOD even after the combat update. Personally, this isn't too high of a priority for me. However, if you're looking to do some of the bosses that require it, definitely go ahead and grab one. Dragon Longsword is another fun special attack. It is one hit that hits very high in damage. It used to have a effect where it ignored the hit cap, but again, like the Lang spec, that kind of has gone to the wayside because the hit cap is now just 30k flat out. I still use D-Long spec at Zami specifically because it is a nice spec to have under Zerk when you're only around 24% adrenaline and you can't really build up to get a D-Claw off before the refresh. However, that's only the real place that I use the D-Long spec. I don't use it anywhere else really. Now over here in the corner, I have 2 EOFs that are definitely more niche for melee specifically, and that would be ZGS and SGB. SGB here is mostly for off-style SGB. It is pretty useful, and the spec itself is strong where it works as the hits are guaranteed now on anything that's a 5x5. So in between Zerks, while you're going for a EZK rotation and you have a lot of adren build up and whatnot, it can be useful to toss out an off-style SGB just for the damage. And the reason ZGS is over here is I've tried to weave ZGS in with EZK and Meteor Strike, or without Meteor Strike and get it in, and I just cannot get ZGS to do the damage that I thought it would. It is still strong. It's a 50% damage increase for 20 seconds, and it acts kind of like a Sunshine or a DS. But overall, I have just seen EZK do more damage so far in terms of DPM. The only place I can think of ZGS still being used is with Melee Camp Carapac. Because of the way the Time Warp work, you're not going to get the cooldown refund on special attacks, so EZK will still take the full minute, so I could see it being used there. Or if you're a melee camp on a team and someone else is already using EZK, this is obviously going to be better than using nothing, because you can't have multiple EZK specs on a target. I don't get as much use from my ZGS EOF because I mostly do solo encounters. But if you do a lot of group content and there are other melee camps on the team that you do said group content with, this might be a worthwhile investment for you. So the reason I put a ZGS in the EoF is so you can cast it with a T95, and the auto attacks that it does will hit slightly higher than if you do it with a T92 or a T90. But if I go ahead and attack this and I hit the EoF spec, you will see that ZGS forms and it hits with auto attacks, and these damage numbers scale based on the tier of weapon used. Now for the more ancillary bits of gear I have, Dragon Battle Axe has been updated to, instead of being an additive bonus, it is now multiplicative, and it is very strong now. If you're doing anything with a melee start like in a hybrid setup, or you're doing melee camp kills, I 100% recommend using a Dragon Battle Axe back on the Adren Crystal, and then building back up to 120% Adrenaline before charging into whatever boss you decide to do. Now you might notice that I am talking about all of this melee gear, and there is an ECB sitting here. And that is because with the accuracy update, you can use Grico on just about any target, and it's not going to hit for any type of damage, but you can still proc the Hydrix effects, and those hits can still crit per usual. So when you use something like Meteor Strike to get the crit adren buff of 8% per hit, you can then swap over and do a greater ricochet, giving you 7 hits, which is a lot of adrenaline, plus proccing the effect of Hydrix, giving some extra adrenaline, and it is very strong, and I'll show you how I set this up later so it's easy to use and pretty seamless. Overall, if you're using Meteor Strike in your rotations, or you're having some type of off-style crit buff with a stalled Incend on a dummy, or you're bringing a Nami swap, I highly recommend bringing some form of greater ricochet swap. It doesn't have to be an ECB, it could be a Royal Crossbow, it could be Ascensions if you wanted to use them, whatever you happen to have that has Caroming on it and some form of Aftershock to keep your stacks, that's all you really need to worry about. I've just had this dyed ECB in my bank for so long, and it hasn't seen any use because ECB EoF is best in slot for range, and the physical ECB isn't worthwhile anymore, so it now just sits here as a Grico swap. Jaws of the Abyss is a worthwhile swap, as any bleed that is active, it gives you an additional 2% adrenaline on basic hits. Now I did kind of skip over Jaws of the Abyss beforehand, however it is worthwhile to swap to, as any bleed that you have on a target is going to give you 2% additional adrenaline per hit, which for when building up to Meteor Strike and building up again for Zerk during an easy K, you get a lot of adrenaline refund with this active. So if you plan on using any bleeds at a boss, I would highly recommend using Jaws of the Abyss. And the last thing gear wise and setup wise I want to talk about for melee is Relics. Usually I'm running COE to get adrenaline refund on Meteor Strike, Berserk, and Overpower. Overall, I think COE is better suited for melee, saving adrenaline on those ultimates rather than just having the additional 10% from something like Heightened Senses. Now yes, there are some speed kill setups that use Heightened Senses, but that is for very niche use cases, not so much general PVM. Now right now for testing, I have Zerk Fury and Font of Life in here, and so far it's worked pretty well at a few places. However, I do like the additional adrenaline per basic that Fury of the Small provides, and since I'm using Zerk a lot, I do like the additional damage reduction as that Death Ward can offer. So you can either really pick between getting more damage on lower HP, or you can go for more adrenaline and a little bit safer approach. Both have their positives and negatives, however the one constant I would say is COE, and whichever two you pick is going to be more so boss dependent than anything else. So just play around with either setup and find out something that works for you depending on the boss that you are killing. Also, as far as spellbook is concerned, I usually run Lunars when melee camping just so I have easy access to Disruption Shield, Vengeance, and a couple other things such as Smoke Cloud sitting in my borrowed power, and that allows me to bring just 2 rune pouches. I could probably simplify this more with combo runes, however I'm pretty lazy and I haven't bought all of the rune pouches yet to set up things like that, so that will have to wait for another day. But I believe that is enough rambling on and explaining all of the gear stuff. Actually, before I finish the gear, I said I would talk about the perks. So best in slot perks as far as melee, the only thing that has changed, like I mentioned before, is mobile on gear. But with weapons, we got a new perk which is called Eruptive, where it just gives you 0.5 0.5% damage increase per rank. And the rework for Equilibrium is not in game right now. I believe it got scrapped. It might be on the back burner. It might be coming out soon. The Equilibrium aura has changed, which gives you a 12% minimum damage increase. However, it does not allow you to crit. It might be something to play with as far as ultra consistent rotations. That might be something I look into a little bit later. But for now, perk meta has not changed, and anything that you have that had Equilibrium 2 on it will now just be Eruptive 2, and you don't have to worry about changing anything. And that setup is relatively consistent on most of my equipment, like my two-handers and whatnot. They all have Eruptive 2. Main hands are going to have Precise 6 Aftershock 1. The only thing that doesn't have it is my Scythe setup. However, this is more so from the early days of Archaeology, and I went for Precise 1 instead of Precise 2 because it was cheaper, and I've never really fixed this weapon since, so maybe I'll do that in the future. If you want full best in slot perks, you can just go ahead and click Search Wiki, type in Biz Perks, like you did for the Pterosaur Maul, and it brings up the optimal PVM perk setup. This is all based off of information from the PVME Discord, and you can pick whether you want an entry or advanced perk. We're obviously going to be in the advanced section, and melee is the default here, so you can go through and find all of the perks that you want. But anyways, that is definitely enough rambling about all of the different gear and explaining it. Let's actually get into some ability information and then some rotations. So as far as abilities are concerned, there are three types of abilities. For those who don't know, we have basic, threshold, and ultimate abilities. Basic abilities give you adrenaline, thresholds take away adrenaline but do more damage, and ultimates use a lot of adrenaline but usually do a lot of damage or give you a time window to do a bunch of increased damage. Now, as far as melee abilities are concerned, there are difference between attack abilities and strength abilities. They're broken up into two different categories, and some of these abilities, as you can see, are used by dual wield, but if I switch over to two hand, other ones will highlight. And the main thing to keep in mind as far as rotations are concerned is that Decimate, Cleave, and Sever are going to be the main three basics that you're going to be using, and maybe something like Havoc or Dismember as your fourth. Now, it used to be Greater Fury was taking this spot, but it is now a 15-second cooldown, but it guarantees the next ability to be a crit. So this is useful inside of your Zerk rotations, buffing up your overpowers or a D-Claw or something like that. And Sever got its cooldown reduced to 5.4 so that it could kind of fill the role of what G-Fury used to be. Now, when doing basic abilities, you'll notice here it's 7.2 on both Decimate and Cleave, so you can use these abilities back to back, and then you need two other abilities to use before you can Deci Cleave again. And like I said before, this can be filled with things like Flanking, Sever, Havoc with the passive glove effect, Dismember if it's part of an EZK rotation. There are several abilities that can be used to fill that gap, and most of the time you're going in through a Zerk or building in an EZK rotation, so you'll be fine anyways, filling in with things like other thresholds. Now, the main melee thresholds that people are using are Assault, Destroy, Flurry, Slaughter, Blood Tendrils, and Hurricane. Assault is usually getting bled by Greater Barge. Because Langswords no longer have a passive to use Hurricane while they're having them equipped, and the Hurricane now shares cooldown again with Destroy. So typically what I have seen is people will use two Hurricanes inside of their Zerk rotation and not so much use Destroy anymore. Although in some situations Bled Destroy is nice because of the stun effect it provides. It's just kind of a use case dependent on the boss situation. Greater Flurry is nice for reducing Zerk cooldown, so people will sometimes bleed that. I personally use this at Zami a lot to get Zerk off cooldown faster, so I can Zerk each of the phases. And Slaughter and Blood Tendrils are very strong, especially when using the Spear. Slaughter, if you can walk a target, it triples its damage, and it obviously counts as a bleed effect for the EZK spec, which leads us into our ultimate abilities, being Zerk and Overpower are the main ones used. Berserk by itself lasts 19.8 seconds, however, Vestments gives you an additional 6, so you get 25.8 in total, which is why people are able to get two Hurricanes, because this cooldown is only 20.4 seconds. And the only other ultimate I really use is Overpower, because of the Zuck cape really buffing this ability. Abilities such as Massacre or Pulverize or Frenzy aren't really used too much right now. They have had their damage adjusted and they're overall a bit stronger, I think. Actually, I'm pretty sure Massacre has not gotten an update. I think it is literally the same and has not been adjusted for the system because literally no one uses this ability. So Berserk and Overpower are going to be your two mainstay ultimates. And now we've gone over the melee abilities, let's go ahead and get into some actual rotations. So to start out, we'll go with the more traditional melee rotations where you're not really using a Grico swap or Meteor Strike to really help build adrenaline and spam out more special attacks. And typically what this will look like in the big picture is you go ahead and do a Berserk rotation that gives you 26 seconds of boosted damage. And then afterwards, you go ahead and build up a little bit, use your Chaos Roar with your Easy K EoF, and go ahead and use 2 Dismembers, a Slaughter, and a Tendrils in that time. And typically, if you have armor spikes in your inventory, that will give you your 5th bleed to then go ahead and maximize all of that damage. And then during that time, you can use things like Hurricane or Greater Flurry, other abilities to kind of fill out the time and damage potential of whatever you're doing, basically waiting for Berserk to come off of cooldown again. Now, I personally don't use these rotations anywhere. I pretty much always play with a crit buff at this point, but some of these rotations might be useful later in some of the guides where I may experiment with Equilibrium to try and build something as consistent as possible, which wouldn't allow crits and just go for full rotations. But anyways, we'll go ahead and do an example here, and we'll go ahead and hit a Zerk with our APOT, target Cycle Barge, hit Hurricane into a Decimate, bleed our Assault, and then here I like to go ahead and use my G Fury to buff up a D-Claw EoF, maybe hit Sever into a Decimate, hit our Overpower, hit a Cleave, another Sever, maybe another basic, and then go ahead and hit our Length Spec into another Hurricane to finish off the Zerk. And then here what I like to do a couple basics, and then go ahead and hit Chaos Roar into our Easy K and equip our Helm, use a Dismember into a Havoc, and a couple more basics, and then go ahead and hit the other 2 bleeds. Another couple basics, maybe a Havoc there. Could go ahead and go for a second Overpower. We happen to Relent proc that. Maybe something like a Destroy as we're waiting for our Zerk cooldown. We don't want to go too crazy on the Easy K. And then you just go into another Zerk rotation and just kind of go forward from there. And that allows you to kind of rinse and repeat, and you won't be able to do that Zerk rotation every single time because you only have APOT for every other Zerk. But what I was trying to say earlier, I kind of got lost a little bit, is you don't want to go too crazy on Greater Flurry usage. In fact, I don't even think I used it at all there, because if you're doing long form damage with melee on something, you're going to get to the point where Easy K is really going to start running into issues where your Zerk is almost off cooldown again, but your Easy K is going to be later and later because you don't have anything to reduce the cooldown of your Easy K. So that is something to keep in mind. The main use case I see for something like this rotation is at Raksha, where you would go from a Zerk to an Easy K for consistent damage, and you could go ahead and use a ZGS afterwards to save your Berserk for P4, or just go for another Berserk to finish out phase 3 if you don't happen to have some of the best in slot gear. But as you can see, I typically just use my D-Claw EoF. Everything else either is niche use or it has something for AoE damage. And yeah, I basically just use the Easy K and the Dragon Claw at most places. Anything else is going to be dependent on the boss. Alrighty, so now we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of melee rotations and where I think this combat style really comes alive, and that is utilizing Meteor Strike and Grico, maybe even some Incendiary Shot stuff later. I'll show you kind of a pre-build that I do for certain bosses, but right now this is going to be just a general rotation utilizing Meteor Crit Adren, giving you 8% adrenaline per crit. Now for this demonstration, I will be using a Calgarian Demon. It's on auto cast, but I want the extra crit chance as well as the Grim in order to really maximize the potential number of crits I can get during a rotation. Now, the best way I see this being implemented into whatever boss you want to try and do this at is to use some sort of combat dummy. You can make them with invention, and we're going to actually start off with an incendiary shot to save our meteor strike for later on in our rotation, because the combat dummies have no defense and you can get the incendiary shot for free, and you can kind of repeat this pattern as far as you need into a boss with the accuracy we now have in the update. Almost forgot to mention this, but how I am doing my Grico swap is I have my ECB bound here with my melee thumb buttons. If you want more detail on how I do all of my inputs in this game, there is a keybind guide that I probably should redo at some point, but it's still pretty much accurate to how I control things. But anyways, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and hit my Grico swap, and as you'll notice, it'll bring up my primary range bar, and then before the hour starts, I just take the prayers and put them on the main bar next to my Grico, so that way I can key roll through these three inputs really easily. And then once I'm done with my Grico swap, I just have the main hand bound here, and if you have it bound, you can hit your offhand slot for the melee thumb button, but because the game has already swapped over bars and just hasn't displayed it yet, you can just use the offhand bind on your main thumb buttons or your main secondary bar, and this can be done with any inputs. It doesn't have to be thumb buttons, but since when I'm melee camping, I'm usually not using range at all, I just put the prayer inputs on the main bar since it's not really going to get used anyway, and if it's a hybrid setup that I would theoretically be doing, I would have all of the binds here, and I would just full swap over to range for a Grico and then swap back. But anyways, that is the order of operations that I have for my Grico swap. I press it on my melee thumb buttons, hit A, S, and D, and then hit my thumb buttons to go back. The only somewhat annoying thing is if I go to range camp something, I have to remember to change out these thumb buttons, but it's not too big of a deal usually. But anyways, those are the inputs that I use to do a Grico swap. Alrighty, so what that would look like in practice, assuming this dummy here is the one that we dropped either outside of the instance of the boss we're killing or inside, and then we're just doing this as part of our pre-build, is we would target it and hit our incendiary shot. And I like to hit piercing as just a buffer so that way Grico actually gets the crit adren effect. Hit a basic, anticipate, Zerk with an A-pot, and then barge, hit our hurricane, and then maybe another basic into an assault bleed, and then we'll go ahead and hit a couple D-claws. Maybe G-Fury this upcoming D-claw. Hit a basic into our overpower. Another basic, and a D-claw just for funsies. Into our Lang spec, and a hurricane. Then afterwards, I'll hit a basic, and then hit a chaos roar into our easy K spec, put on the helmet, and start doing an easy K rotation of just getting as many bleeds out as possible and filling in with basic abilities. Also, Havoc or Smash is going to work with the glove effect that we have. Then we'll go ahead and hit our last base, or our last bleed, and we'll go ahead and hit Meteor Strike. And I'm going to hit Flurry here. Zerk is back off cooldown. Zerk, and then hit Barge. Don't have Adrenaline for the Hurricane this time, so I'll just bleed the Assault after 2 basics. Maybe go for the Overpower. Go for another Grico. Maybe hit a D-Claw. Into a basic, into a G-Fury. Go for another Lang spec. Maybe a hurricane, and then kind of just rinse and repeat from there. After this Zerk, the easy K spec should be off cooldown, ready for you to go after a couple basic abilities, so on and so forth. Once you're done with that round of easy K, you could go ahead and pop the incendiary shot onto the boss, and if you're worried about it going off, that is something you could use Ingenuity the Humans for. Although so far in this update for combat, I have not noticed it splashing even in full melee gear at a place like Raksha where accuracy can be a bit of a problem. But now what I'm going to go ahead and do is show how I actually do a beginning Zerk rotation for going into pretty much any boss in game other than Zami specifically, but that's because there's minions, and Zami I follow more of a specific rotation for that boss. But this could work for the start of Glaykor, it could work for Karapak, it could work for Dino Boss, most of the elite dungeon bosses. It could work for farming out a God Wars 2 log if you really wanted to. The possibilities are kind of endless. So let's go ahead and get right into that. So what I do for this quote unquote full tilt setup or full DPM or full send, whatever we want to call it, is I'll go to the adrenaline crystal here, get my adrenaline, make sure all my buffs and whatnot are in order, and then go ahead and hit the dragon battle axe. By the way, you can use this method even with the previous Zerk. It all depends on if you want to deal with stalls or not. And now that we have our adrenaline, I equip my range weapon and click this dummy that's close, install the incendiary shot, and then click on the adrenaline crystal to build adren. Adrenaline crystal will not wipe out any stalls, neither does dive. Darkness, you can press darkness and it will keep your stall. And then I go in, I would drop my dummy, and then target cycle, release the stall with a natural instinct. And here I'm just going to hit a couple of abilities, then my basic or my anticipate, Zerk, barge, hit a hurricane into a D-claw, bleed the assault, and then just kind of get as many D-claws out as the game will let me, depending on crit chance. Here I think we'll get 4. And then I'll go ahead and G-Fury. I'm going to hit length spec now so I can then overpower. Maybe hit another ability and then finish with a hurricane, and then go into the classic Chaos Roar, easy K, equip our helm, get our first bleed out. I'm going to use 2 basics here so I can then get the 2 bleeds. And then just start building up here. Meteor Strike is available almost instantly, but I'm going to go ahead and use a couple flurry hits to get Zerk back faster. Use another bleed, another basic, go for the Meteor Strike this time, Grico, another basic, equip my Vestments helm again to go over 100%, anticipate, Zerk, barge, and kind of just repeat the process. I'm gonna go ahead and G-Fury my assault here, go for a couple D-claws, because then I can go ahead and just hit another Grico, get some decent adrenaline from that, another overpower, got a relent proc there, which was very handy. And then I'm going to go ahead and G-Fury my length spec, hit my hurricane, and then just kind of rinse repeat the process here. As you see, easy K spec is already back after that Zerk. And then once I go ahead and do that easy K, I can then go ahead and pop incendiary shot onto a boss once again and rinse repeat. The only difference here between this kind of full send setup and the one that I showed previously is that it did involve stalling the incendiary shot and then releasing that on a dummy that you bring into the instance or outside of the instance, whatever the boss that you're specifically killing requires. And some people don't like playing with stalls. I was one of those people for a while. I really just kind of avoided them, and I was like, no, I just want to keep it simple. But after playing with them and starting to get used to stalling stuff on this dummy here and then bringing it in, it's been a lot of fun. And the main benefit of doing that is you're able to use natural instinct with it and build up adren very quickly, and that effect is a very useful inside of your Zerk when you're doing a crit buff, as you can tell with how many D-claws I was able to spam. Because I believe what's happening there is that with the crit effect is that natural instinct is doubling the adren gain from those crit buffs, so I'm getting 16 adrenaline per crit. And so typically when I only see 1 to maybe 3 crits per D-claw, that is still almost positive adrenaline. Or if it's only 2 crits, then you're pretty much there. Overall, having natural instinct on your first Zerk of a boss kill is very advantageous, and I wanted to show off this little method for y'all. But if you guys are just fine with doing the kind of standard no meteor, no crit buff, you don't want to play with Grico switching, you want to go straight forward, that's perfectly okay. You're allowed to do melee DPM as you see fit. But if you want to push it further and really use any benefit you can find to get melee to do more damage, there's nothing wrong with that either. Everyone in this game is comfortable with a certain level of full send, and wherever we want to play the game at is perfectly fine. Now, before I close out this guide, I just want to go over kind of my ability prioritization that I keep in the back of my head and kind of the general principles I'm using, mostly in terms of ability prioritization as far as any rotation is concerned. So with Berserk, I typically try and get 2 hurricanes out. I try and bleed my assault with barge. I usually go for 1 overpower, as many D-claw EoFs as the game will let me get out before before just totally nuking all of my adrenaline to 0. And I will go for a Lang spec towards the end of Zerk, and that's because I like to let the Lang's weapons build up as many primordial ice strikes as they can during a Zerk. Sometimes I only see 2, but sometimes during a Zerk I've seen as many as 5. And so saving it for the second to last ability before your Hurricane that finishes off the Zerk is usually pretty beneficial. And as for my easy K rotation, I try to keep it to where the only threshold I use is a Greater Flurry to get my Zerk cooldown back, so that way I can immediately, after using Meteor Strike, not worry about waiting a couple seconds for Zerk to come off cooldown, and I can just immediately go for a Grico, and then maybe a Decimate if I'm only on like anywhere from 60 to 80% adrenaline. But I will typically finish off that mini build before the next Zerk with an Anticipate, because you need 6 game ticks worth of waiting to charge up the barge effect in order to barge in and get your Bleed Assault, which is very worthwhile for Zerk rotations. Anyways, I think I have gone on long enough and probably put out a bit too much information in this one, but I appreciate you guys watching till the end. Thank you all very much for watching. Your viewership is greatly appreciated. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I will see y'all next time for the next guide. Peace.